Hello everyone, back to today's first video. We're going to have a look at some spring analogues for today's first video. So we haven't really done too many updates for the spring of 2018 at GWV so far. I've had sort of a break from the longer range stuff after the long season of winter updates. I want to calm things down a little bit through December. But we're well into January now. It's time to start building things up again for the coming season, which is going to be spring 2018, of course. We will be releasing the spring 2018 forecast on Sunday the 25th of February, the final Sunday of next month. So time's getting on now. It's definitely time to begin to start getting some updates together for the spring. Of course, we have done one season one roundup. That was at the end of December. Other than that, we haven't really touched on the spring very much. So our Analogues guru, James Acrill, a big thank you to James for coming up with the analogues for us, as always. Our Analogues guru, James Acrill, has been looking at some analogues for us for this first update. And it's going to be kind of like a follow-on from winter updates in many ways. Remember back in winter updates, we had a look at solar activity and had a look at the winters that were both 2 years before solar minimum and the winters that were just preceding solar minimum. And we're going to follow that through, actually, for the spring updates. That's what we're going to do for today's analogues. We're going to have a look at all springs back to solar cycle number 10, which were start 2 years before solar minimum. And then we're going to have a look at the springs that were directly before solar minimum. We're probably, for this spring, 2018, we're probably at the 2 years before solar minimum. But we'll have a look at both 2 and 1 year before solar minimum and see if there's any differences between those springs. So that's what we're going to do for our first video today. The GWV Sunday Roundup will be with you later on today, probably around lunchtime. So look out for that if you would like to do that. Just say it's going to be quite a long video, so you can't watch it all in one go. Don't worry, it will be kept on the spring updates and forecast page indefinitely. Later on today, there'll be a written report that goes with this video. So you can come back and watch the video when you want, and also you can have a read of that written report. You usually get that up around 7, 8 o'clock in the evening, something like that. So without further ado, let's get on with our spring 2018 analogues update part 1. So, as I said, we've been going to look at solar activity for part 1 of our spring 2018 analogues. This is the solar disk on our side of this today from solarham.net. Just to prove that we are now at a very low level of solar activity, just one sunspot showing up there. Have a look at the GWV's solar tracker. This will be featured in the Sunday Roundup, but you get a little sneak peek of it for this analogues update. So you can see we are at a very, very minimal level of solar activity now. This is where we are right now. I won't go through the solar tracker for this video, but it will be featured in the Sunday Roundup coming up later on today. But in terms of solar activity at a minimum level, we probably aren't at solar minimum yet. So that's why I think it's going to be the first batch of analogues that we look at for this video. I think they're probably the more relevant ones for this spring, actually, because I think have probably got another year to 18 months to go before we reach true solar minimum. So actually next spring, 2019, will probably be sort of the proper solar minimum spring of solar cycle number 24. You never really know. Sometimes you'll have shorter solar cycles, but I've got a feeling because this is such a weak cycle, it'll probably be quite a long cycle. So I reckon actually next spring will be kind of like the true solar minimum spring. But anyway, that does prove that we are at a very low level, minimal level of solar activity right now. We're trading days that some days have got some sunspots, other days have got no sunspots, and sort of like we're trading days and flatlining with our trend lines, which is thick green and thick red lines. So let's have a look at these analogues. We're going to start off by having a look at the solar cycle number 10. So this is the spring of 1865, and it was two sort of springs before, or 2 years before, solar cycle number, the solar minimum of solar cycle number 10. So it's kind of like where we are right now in our current solar cycle. And the following year, 1866, was the true sort of solar minimum of solar cycle number 10. But this is how the spring of 1865 looks 2 years before the solar minimum of solar cycle number 10, and it does show a blocking signal. So we find that we've got above average heights to our north, centering around Iceland. And then if we change the colours, we've got below average heights in the Atlantic, and over there, that's a little bit wrong, so we've got below average heights over there, and just there, and then we've got above average heights centering around Iceland through this spring. Jet stream would be going something a little bit like that, and you would expect we'd be bringing in lots of sort of easterly, northerly or northeasterly influences. So that spring, the spring of 1865, should be quite a coldish spring, you would have thought. The next spring is 1877, and it's from solar cycle number 11, 2 years before the solar minimum of the solar cycle number 11. This is what we see, and again we've got above average heights around Greenland, so again a bit of a blocking signal. We've got below average heights through much of northern and western Europe, and again you'll think this is quite a cool, quite an unsettled looking spring in the spring of 1877. Remember, this first batch of analogues, these springs are probably more relevant to where we are in the solar cycle for this spring compared to the second batch of analogues. So in some ways, this batch of analogues probably is the most important batch out of the two. Our next spring is from solar cycle number 12. It's the spring of 1888, 2 years before the solar minimum of solar cycle number 12. We find this spring turning up. Again, it's another blocking pattern here, with above average heights to the northwest around Greenland, below average heights through much of central, northern, western Europe. And again, with the jet stream, we're going to be doing something rather like that. So I placed on the cold side of the jet. That looks like it would be a pretty cold, certainly early on in the spring, quite a wintry looking signal for the spring of 1888. Bear in mind, these are from the Victorian era, so we're back into a very long time ago when the general climate was much colder than it is now, so that probably is having some effect to some degree. But nevertheless, it is quite a strong signal so far that these sort of weak solar cycle sort of springs, these sort of weak solar cycle periods for these springs, if you like, are showing quite a blocking signal. This is the spring of 1900, and it's from solar cycle number 13. So again, 2 years before the solar minimum of solar cycle number 13, we see this. And again, it's another spring that has a very strong blocking signal, ridging through the Atlantic, going up towards Greenland. And then this deep trough of below average heights extending through northern and central Europe. With the jet stream, we're doing something like that. So that looks a very unsettled spring, as well as being quite cold as well in the spring of 1900. Go through to solar cycle number 14, and this is the spring of 1912. So 2 years before the solar minimum of solar cycle number 14, we find this. It's a very unsettled looking spring. This one probably not overly cold. This is more of a westerly signal. So we've got above average pressure around the Azores. That's the ever-present Azores high. We've got the jet stream more or less coming through the country like that. And it just looks like a very unsettled spring. During 1912, you expect quite a lot of wet weather to be coming in off the Atlantic. There is a little bit of a blocking signal, but it's very weak. And overall, this is a westerly spring, so probably quite a mild spring. but also quite wet as well in the spring of 1912. The spring of 1922 is next. This is solar cycle number 15, and this one does have quite a blocking signal, again, to our north. Then we've got the below average heights through the Atlantic and going into much of northern Europe. The jet stream is going through rather like that. So, in many ways, similar to 1912, slightly stronger blocking signal, but overall a very unsettled looking spring. Again, probably quite Atlantic dominated, and you wouldn't look at that and think it's overly cold. There will probably be some colder interludes, but I imagine this is just a very unsettled spring again in the spring of 1912. Spring 1932 comes up next. This is from solar cycle number 16, so we're getting ever closer to the current solar cycle, which is number 24, of course. And we've returned to the blocking signal. So the spring of 1932 looks like this. It has a trough of below average heights across northwestern parts of Europe. It has a ridge of above average heights centering around Greenland. And so therefore you expect this to be a very cool, maybe even cold spring. You expect quite a lot of northerly episodes, northerly outbreaks to be coming into this spring, and probably quite an unsettled spring as well. So the spring of 1932 looks like it should be cold and unsettled. Spring of 1942 is next. This is from solar cycle number 17, 2 years before the solar minimum of solar cycle number 17. We see this, and it's a very different pattern to anything that we've seen so far. So we've got this area below average heights in the Atlantic, but then we've got kind of like this bizarre circle of above average heights, kind of to the south and to the east, and to the north, to the west as well. I'm not sure what's going on there. Very odd-looking chart, but I would have thought this is quite a mildish signal for the spring. Probably doing something rather like that. So, a very odd-looking reanalysis chart there for the spring of 1942. I imagine there would have been some quite wet weather in the west at times, but in the east, probably some dry weather. And I would have thought potentially quite a mild or maybe even quite warm spring there in 1942. Very different to anything we've seen so far. Now, this is spring 1952. This is from solar cycle number 18. And this one has quite a strong blocking signal up to our north, but it also extends a little bit to the east as well. But then we have this area of below average pressure in the Atlantic. So this isn't an overly cold spring. Despite the fact it has quite a strong blocking signal, I think the flow and the jet stream is doing something rather like that. Now, there was a very impressive blizzard at the end of March 1952, but overall I'm not sure that's a particularly cold looking spring in 1952, probably reasonably dry, although in the west and southwest you will get some wet weather from that trough. This one looks more unsettled. This is the spring of 1963, following the brutal winter of 62-63. Of course, we find that we go into an Atlantic-driven spring. So, after all of those cold easterly and northerly winds through the winter, the spring of 1963 went westerly. And obviously, it would have thawed things out and turned them milder. And that is indeed what happened. The cold and snow stayed on the ground well into March 1963, but then when it went, it properly did go, and we went into quite an unsettled and reasonably mild spring, actually, after that very cold start to it, with the wind coming in from off the Atlantic. So unsettled and mild for the spring of 1963. 1974 comes up next. This is from solar cycle number 20. This one has lots of below average pressure, below average heights out to the west and southwest, and then we have above average heights centering to our north, which means probably a lot of easterly winds through this spring, and I would have thought generally very dry as well. The summer of 1974 was very wet, but the spring looks like it should probably have been really quite dry. 1985 comes up next. This is following that very cold winter of the 1985. This one shows that the blocking pattern that we had during the winter of 84-85 does continue to some degree during the spring. But it is a weaker signal, and actually it's a very unsettled spring in 1985 with below average heights of pressure across many central western parts of Europe, and the jet stream is going like that. So very often through that spring we're placed on the cold side of the jet, and we're very unsettled as well. So quite a cold and unsettled spring in 1985. The spring of 1995 is next. This is from solar cycle number 22. We're almost up to as far as we can go, which will be solar cycle 23 with these analogues. So this one's a very dry spring. We're blocking off the Atlantic. It's time to set up the pattern actually for that long hot summer of 1995. This one has below average pressure to the east and above average pressure out to the west. So we've got low pressure extending through here, but above average pressure is to our west, blocking off the Atlantic, which means that very often the wind is going rather like that. So it was quite cool at times actually through the spring of 1995. There were a couple of quite snowy episodes during March 1995. The middle of April 1995 was quite cold as well, although actually April 95 was a reasonably mild month. And then May 1995 is interesting because that starts off very hot in the first week of May, but then there was snow in the middle of the month. So it was a rather odd spring in 1995. The main issue with it is that we have that big ridge through the Atlantic, which means it's a very dry spring. We block off the Atlantic, we alternate the winds. Sometimes the winds are northerly and quite cold, but other times we do get some very warm weather during the spring of 1995. And overall, this is laying the foundations for that long hot summer of 1995. And then finally, we go to 2007, which is 2 years before the solar minimum of solar cycle number 23. So what we find with this one is that it's a very high pressure dominated spring. I'm sure you remember it. It's a really, really dry spring, focusing on an exceptionally mild, if not warm, April. All the low pressure is up here, and the jet stream is going like that. Really, really dry through the spring of 2007 until we get to the end of May, when suddenly all of that dry weather breaks and we go into a very wet Whitsun weekend at the end of May 2007, and then that takes us into what is an exceptionally wet summer of 2007. But the spring itself, particularly March and April, have a lot of dry weather. So a real mixed bag with these springs. We start off with quite a strong blocking signal for the springs that are a long time ago, but as we get closer and closer to the current sort of modern climate, I think to a large degree we do lose that blocking signal quite a lot with these springs, and they are very, very variable, these later springs. So they all look rather different, with high pressure and low pressure of the troughs and the ridges in very different positions. Let's just have a look at the springs that are actually the solar minimum springs. So these are kind of like within a year of solar minimum. So you can say, or less than a year within solar minimum, if you'd like. So you can say these are the proper solar minimum springs of these solar cycles. We come back again to solar cycle number 10, and this is the spring of 1866. This one has, again, a bit of a blocking ridge to the north with below average heights to the south. You will think that's quite a cold looking pattern for the spring of 1866, and very unsettled too. The solar minimum spring of solar cycle number 11 is 1878, and this one we have above average heights to the north, below average heights over the UK. So this is kind of like starting to set the pattern for what's going to happen at the end of the year of 1878 and into that next ferociously cold year of 1879. Excuse me. So that one looks like it's a pretty cold and unsettled looking spring as well. This is the spring of 1889. It's the solar minimum spring, if you like, of solar cycle number 12. We find that we've got below average heights to our south, above average heights to our north and to our northeast. This looks like it should be a very unsettled spring. At times you will think probably quite cold, but at other times I imagine we're bringing up the winds from the south, so reasonably mild. But the thing to take from that is it is a very, very unsettled spring indeed. This is the spring of 1901 from solar cycle number 13. And this one looks a very unsettled spring too, with below average heights to our south, above average heights to the north. Again, you would think that's quite a coolish spring, plenty of easterly winds, and probably really quite wet, especially down in the south. And this is 1913. This is the solar minimum spring of solar cycle number 14, and this one looks really, really unsettled. Look at that below average area of pressure that's around the UK and in the Atlantic. No high pressure anywhere close to us, so that looks like probably a real deluge spring in 1913. Probably not particularly cold. The air's coming in off the Atlantic, so I would imagine it's a reasonably mild spring at times, but very wet, I would have thought, the spring of 1913. 1923 comes up next. This one looks very unsettled spring as well, with below average heights across most of Western Europe. We have got a bit of a blocking signal up to our north. I'm not sure it's enough really to do anything particularly wet. We're doing something like that with the flow and with the jet stream in 1923. 1933 comes up next. This one looks more settled. We've got above average heights through the UK and much of Western Europe as well. The Atlantic has we have below average pressure in the Atlantic, and doing something like that with flow with jet stream. I imagine that's quite a nice spring in 1933. Plenty of dry and quite warm weather, I would have thought there. And 1943 from solar cycle number 17 looks really quite good as well, with above average heights around much of northern and central and western Europe, below average heights up to the north, and with the flow, we're on the mild side of the jet stream, so the flow and the jet are going something like that. They look like two really good springs in 1933 and again in 1943. Very nice springs indeed. And then 1953 looks quite good as well. So these actual solar minimum springs, as we go into the middle of the 20th century anyway, are beginning to demonstrate a pattern of quite a lot of high pressure, quite a lot of above average heights through much of northern and central Europe. So again, plenty of high pressure there. That looks like a really nice, dry, very pleasant spring indeed in 1953. 1964 breaks things down a little bit. This is the spring of 1964, so this is like the solar minimum spring of solar cycle number 19. And we have below average heights and pressure in the Atlantic, and we're moving the jet stream through like that. So that one looks a much more unsettled spring. Probably not a deluge, but it does look more unsettled than those previous three springs of 33, 43, and 53, that was just looking at. Our next spring is 1975 from solar cycle number 20. Now, this is quite a cold spring, interestingly, so it does have quite a blocking signal here out to the northwest, and then we've got the below average heights and pressure down to the southwest. And this one brings in a lot of northerly winds. Of course, we have that snow event at the start of June 1975, but also interestingly, through kind of like April, particularly 1975, there was quite a lot of cold weather as well. So that's a fairly cold spring in 1975. 1986 is next, and this one is very different again. This one is really, really unsettled, with below average heights over and to the west of the UK, and with the flow and the jet, we're doing something like that. But it was quite a cold spring as well in 1986, but also very wet at times. Really dismal spring in 1986, very delayed in many respects. The spring of 1996 comes up next. This is from the solar minimum spring of solar cycle number 22. And this one follows on from the cold winter of 95-96, of course. So basically it's the same pattern as we have through the winter of 95-96, with the above average heights to the north, below average heights, to change the colour, down to the south, and a lot of easterly winds coming in through the spring of 1996. A lot of easterly winds following on from the easterly winds of the winter of 95-96, of course. It was a cold spring as well, very cold during May 1996. Also cold in March with several snowy episodes. April was a little bit warmer, although there was, even then, a couple of snowy outbreaks. But the main thing that spring is remembered for is a very cold and very dismal month in May 1996. And then finally, we come to 2008. So this is spring 2008, the solar minimum spring of solar cycle number 23. And this one is quite a cold block signal. So below average heights to over and to the east of the UK, we have above average heights up to the north around Greenland, and bringing the flow through like that. There was quite a lot of cold weather during the spring of 2008. The winter of 07-08 was mild, very mild, but the spring did turn colder, and there was quite an extended spell of cold weather from memory, from around the middle of March through to the middle of April. Although in May 2008, interestingly, it turned very warm. It was a warm May in 2008, and then the summer 2008 became really quite dismal. If we just combine all those years, so we'll deal with the first package first of all. Remember, these are probably more relevant. These springs are probably more relevant to the spring that we are at of 2018, because I think we're still at least 18 months or so away from solar minimum. So these springs, starting with 1865, and going down to 2007, if you combine all of those years together, all years combined, you do come out with a blocking signal above average heights to the north, but below average heights then are down to the south. So overall, it is quite a cold and blocked signal. But the only thing I would say about that is a lot of that is down to the first winters in the Victorian era, in the 1800s. And I think it did get a lot more variable as we came closer and closer towards the modern sort of climate that we've got right now. Much more variable in those final sort of 4 or 5 springs, I think. And then this is how all years combined look for the actual solar minimum springs. These are the springs that are within or less than 1 year of solar minimum, so they are like the true solar minimum springs of their solar cycles. And again, it's an unsettled pattern. We do still have a blocking signal around Greenland, but these actually look more unsettled, these springs. If anything, deep trough of low pressure over and to the west and the southwest of the UK. And whilst there is more of a blocking signal in evidence, you will think generally these are just very, very wet springs, and occasionally they might be cold, but overall they just look like being very, very unsettled, very wet springs indeed. But it's these that we've got to focus on, because these are the ones that are more relevant for where we are right now. It does look overall like it's a blocking signal. It does look like overall it's quite a coldish signal with these springs, so favouring more blocked and colder conditions. But we do have to take into account the variability that we saw there with the later springs, because I think a lot of that blocking is probably going to be down to the earlier springs that occur in the 1800s, in the Victorian era, just into the start of the 20th century, which is overall a much colder period overall, of course. So if we was to take those out, I suspect we would see a rather weaker blocking pattern, actually, if we just concentrate. Let's say we just concentrated on the springs from 1950 to I think it's 2007 we finished for that batch of analogues. If we just concentrated on that period, I suspect we would see a much weaker blocking signal. Actually, I might ask James to do that, and we might follow this through in a subsequent update. So we'll see what happens with that. Overall, it does look like it's a signal for blocking, but I think we do have to take into account the fact that there was a lot of variability appearing within these springs as we get through to the final sort of 4, 5 or 6 springs from those solar cycles. Nevertheless, we will place this with the spring updates and analogues, and of course it will factor in to the spring forecast that we're going to issue on, I think I said it was 25th of February, didn't I? So 25th of February, that's all to spring forecast. This will make up part of that. There'll be more analogues coming up as well. We want to have a look at ENSO springs and compare that to where we are right now, kind of in a week, and fading La Nina springs. That's something we'll be looking at, and probably a couple of other bits and bobs as well. Also, there'll be a second seasonal model roundup at the end of this month. The final Sunday of January we'll have a seasonal model roundup for you. So it is all starting to kick off now with the longer range again at GWV, and it is building up to the spring forecast being released on the 25th of February. Alright, so that's it for your for part 1 of Spring 2018 Analogues. More coming up in the next few weeks. Later on today, we'll have the GWV Sunny Roundup, so come back. That'll be around or just after lunchtime. But at just gone half an hour, a little bit shorter than those winter updates that we did, just after half an hour. That's all for now, and thanks for watching.